The name of the company was unknown to most of the world until a very brutal and gruesome day, March 31st, 2004. 4 Blackwater operatives were leading a convoy of empty flatbed trucks that were going to pass through Fallujah. And their mission that day, and Fallujah is in the west of Iraq, and at the time, in March of 2004, it was declared a no-go zone by the U.S. military. The U.S. military wouldn't even go into the center of the city, not to mention without an armored vehicle. At 9:30 in the morning, a soft-skin vehicle, as it's called, an unarmored vehicle driven by a Blackwater operative, pulls into the city. Behind it are 2 empty flatbed trucks, and taking up the rear is another soft-skin vehicle, a Mitsubishi Pajero. So you have a Blackwater driver, and you have a man in the passenger seat also working for Blackwater, and there should have been a 3rd man in the vehicle that day, who would have been a rear gunner armed with a saw, a belt-fed automatic weapon with a 180-degree view of the rear. But that day, there were only 2 Blackwater men in each of them, the driver, the navigator, and no rear gunner. They pull into the city, they hit some sort of a roadblock. The rear vehicle is ambushed by resistance fighters who are able to simply walk up and kill the men because they were in unarmored vehicles. They then torch their car and begin hacking away at the men. The lead vehicle realizes that an ambush is underway, and they either try to get off the X, as is the industry slang, meaning get away from the scene of a hostile situation, or turn around to try to help their comrades who had been hit. They too were overtaken by resistance fighters, and you may recall what happened next. A mob of people descended on those vehicles, and they literally ripped those men apart, limb from limb. They burned their bodies. They tied one of them to the back of a truck and dragged him through the streets, and they strung 2 of their charred bodies up from a bridge over the Euphrates River. And back in the United States, the way that the media coverage went down was that these men were described as civilian contractors, as though they were building water pipelines or engaged in construction projects in Iraq. In fact, it took quite some time before it was made clear to the American people in the world that they were actually working for a private military corporation called Blackwater USA. What happened as a result of the deaths of those 4, not U.S. soldiers, not U.S. civilians, but employees of a private military company profiting off of the war, was that the Bush administration sidestepped the advice of the military commanders on the ground in Fallujah, who had said it would be suicide to take Fallujah by force. We have to try a hearts and minds approach. And the administration ordered a massive revenge assault on the city. U.S. forces surrounded Fallujah. They sent in psychological operations teams. They began hurling epithets through loudspeakers at the Iraqis of Fallujah, trying to think up the most despicable, disgusting things to say and have translated into Arabic. And when the Iraqis would come out and fire off their weapons, they would get gunned down, and the troops on the ground referred to it as Lala Fallujah. And they would often play the music of AC/DC or Guns N' Roses during this macabre display. In all, the United States would carry out 37,000 airstrikes against Fallujah. They destroyed or damaged 19,000 of the city's 39,000 buildings. They hit a mosque, bombed a mosque with a Hellfire missile launched from a helicopter. And the U.S. said it wasn't a violation of international law because insurgents were occupying the mosque. Inside of the city, bodies were piling up, dogs were tearing away at people who were rotting in the streets, and we know this because Al Jazeera had a live camera inside of the city, the Arabic language satellite channel that's broadcast to over 70 million people a day. We didn't see that footage in the United States. We heard tales of fierce fighting between insurgents and the U.S. forces, but because Al Jazeera was in the city, most of the rest of the world was able to see the footage inside of Iraq. A colleague of mine and a close friend of mine, Dar Jamail, was able to make it into Fallujah during the siege as an unembedded reporter, and he reported that U.S. snipers were shooting at ambulances that were trying to retrieve the wounded. In all, about 600 people died during that initial siege of Fallujah. Thousands were displaced from their homes, and so devastating was it to the U.S. propaganda machine that Al Jazeera was there with a live camera feed giving lie to the pronouncements of the propagandists in Washington around the clock for the rest of the world, not here, that they made a condition for a ceasefire against Fallujah that Al Jazeera leave the city. And the individual who was the correspondent for Al Jazeera at the time was like the Anderson Cooper of the Arabic media scene. His name was Ahmed Mansour, a very well-known journalist on Al Jazeera, and the cameraman was an Iraqi. Imagine the burden on those journalists, knowing that they have the only camera in the city that was going to be able to document this crime against humanity, this collective punishment, as the head of the UN Iraq program at the time called it, and being told that if you don't leave the city with your camera, that the pummeling and harming and killing of the citizens of that city will continue. And ultimately, the journalists of Al Jazeera decided that it would have been a greater crime for them to leave the city than it would be for them to stay and bear witness to what was happening. And so because of them, we know what happened. And the reason why I go into so much detail about what happened to the city of Fallujah is because it was a revenge attack over the deaths of 4 corporate personnel who were neither U.S. military nor U.S. civilians. And in fact, the Marines graffitied that bridge and they said in permanent marker, "This is for the Americans of Blackwater." While this siege was underway back in Washington, Blackwater's executives kicked into high gear. Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, called up the Alexander Strategy Group, a high-powered Republican lobbying firm that was founded and staffed by former senior staffers of then House Majority Leader Tom DeLay. It was the jewel of what was called the K Street Project, the lobbying project of the Republican political machine. And with his Alexander Strategy lobbyists steering him around, Eric Prince and other Blackwater executives found themselves in a series of face-to-face meetings with the senators and representatives who literally oversaw the business of the private war game. They met with John Warner, the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. They met with Duncan Hunter, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, and with several other crucial, influential Republican lawmakers. March 31st, 2004, 4 Blackwater operatives killed in Fallujah. April 1st, 2004, Alexander Strategy Group hired. By June of 2004, Blackwater was awarded a $320 million contract to provide diplomatic security for the U.S. State Department, and that was the moment that solidified its place as a central part of the occupation machine. I call that making a killing off of the killings. And when the families of those 4 men who were killed in Fallujah tried to get answers from Blackwater as to why were they there in unarmored vehicles when the military wouldn't even go in, not to mention without an armored vehicle. Why were there only 4 men? Why didn't they have heavy weaponry? Why weren't they given a map? Why was my son not even in Iraq for 48 hours before he was sent into the most dangerous city on earth? They say that the company was stonewalling, refusing to answer their questions, wouldn't be straight with them. And so finally, after one of the mothers of those guys was told if she wanted to see the company's incident report on what happened in Fallujah, that she would have to sue Blackwater. She says that when she asked for it, they said, "It's a confidential document, you'll have to sue us." So that's what they did. 4 middle American families, most of them conservative Republicans, filed a groundbreaking wrongful death lawsuit against Blackwater USA in January of 2005. And Blackwater struck back hard with their high-paid, high-powered Republican lawyers. And the argument that Blackwater put forward is quite a novel one. They didn't say anything about the armored vehicles. They didn't say anything about the 4 men instead of 6. They didn't say anything about the heavy machine gun. No, Blackwater's argument was this: we can't be sued. You see, what Blackwater was saying is, we're a part of the U.S. total force. Donald Rumsfeld classified us as such. So we should enjoy the same immunity from civilian litigation for wrongful death enjoyed by the U.S. military. At the same time, their high-paid lobbyists from the Alexander Strategy Group were waxing poetic in the media about how it would be inappropriate to place Blackwater's forces under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the court-martial system, because we're civilians. So when it's convenient, the Blackwater operatives are part of the U.S. military machine, and when it's convenient, they're actually rank-and-file civilians. And this lawsuit is still ongoing, and there have been 11th-hour maneuvers, and it's supposed to go forward in state court in North Carolina, but Blackwater is a very powerful entity, and right now it's in the hands of the Fourth Circuit, whether or not it's going to proceed to trial or be settled in a private arbitration. Right before the trial was supposed to begin, Blackwater went to a senior judge in North Carolina and got him to order the case into arbitration. One of the arbiters on the case was supposed to be William Webster, the former director of the FBI. This is a very powerful corporation, and it's not just active in Iraq, and it's not just about Fallujah, and it's not just about the half-dozen deadly incidents involving the company in the past year in Iraq.